We are back, and we are joined now by Neil J. Young, writer and author of Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. Neil, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, the gay Republican. when, how do you start your history of the gay Republican? Where is the first kind of marker that you'd like to throw down in terms of the conservative movement and gay people or LGBTQ plus people within that movement?
Yeah, I mean, when I set out to write the book, I thought that it would start in the late 1970s because that's when the first gay Republican organizations were formed. But as I dug into the research, I realized I actually wanted to begin in the 1950s, in the era of the Cold War, and this period that was known as the Lavender Scare, where the federal government was, repressing homosexuals all over the country, was criminalizing their behavior, arresting them. But I realized there was a lot of prominent, very closeted, but important gay Republican activists, both in Washington, D.C., who were, fundamental to the rise of modern conservatism, and also folks who were out in California, where a lot of my book is set, who were starting to be politically active, but were doing so, again, as closeted or semi-closeted gay Republicans.
The Lavender Scare, can you expand on that? And what were the origins of that moral panic, basically?
Yeah. So in the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, there were, huge fears that the country was under communist threat and that subversives within the nation would betray the country to the communists. And so there was, the Red Scare, which was about rooting out communists from the U.S. and especially in the federal government, this idea that they were in the State Department, that they were turning over state secrets to the communists, to the Soviet Union. But there was also this idea that homosexuals were a subversive threat to the nation, because the idea was that homosexuals were very likely to be turned. This notion was that they were sexual deviants, and so they could also become political deviants. They would be easily turned into communists, and that they would serve as spies within the federal government, especially the State Department. And so both political parties were very committed to rooting out homosexuals from any service in the federal government. But that spirit and even that sort of political effort bled out to all over the country. So local law enforcement in every city was, interested in finding homosexuals, arresting them, criminalizing them, and really ruining their lives. And this was a horrific and really invasive work on the part of the government to criminalize and ruin homosexuals' lives in the mid 20th century.
How were laws deployed in that way? I mean, were there a lot? We see in the context, particularly of abortion right now, like the reuse, the re-upping of anti, of pro-censorship or laws that are supposed to regulate basically people from being deviant in any way. What were some of those tactics that law enforcement used?
Yeah, so this started at the top. President Eisenhower issued an executive order in 1950 that that oversaw the government's work in rooting out homosexuals from government employment. But at the state and local level, there are all sorts of like vice laws that had to do with things like gross indecency or public indecency, and these gave law enforcement and police huge leeway to arrest people that they suspected of being homosexual. I mean, they didn't even have to necessarily catch someone in the act, but often they saw, groups of men walking down the street, or if you were sitting in a park, you could be arrested on charges of gross indecency. And so those are just sort of some examples, but I also think it's really important to know that every department, every agency of the government was really devoted to this. This included the U.S. Post Office. The Post Office was in coordination with the FBI, was surveilling people that they suspected of being homosexual, watching their mail, tracing it. If you subscribe to a physique magazine, or if they noticed that you were writing a lot, if you were a single man and you were writing a lot of letters to other single men, they would put trackers on those other men's mail. And so, and if they suspected of being homosexual from the mail they were writing or the mail they were receiving, they would turn their names over to law enforcement and have them arrested. And so I think people don't appreciate or really know this history of how extensive law enforcement and the federal government network was in finding homosexuals and arresting them, criminalizing them, and again, ruining their lives.
And I have so many questions. One is, I noticed the focus on men, right?
Yes.
This moral panic being fairly directed towards homosexual men, but also when you mention the FBI and its role in having the post office track individuals in this manner. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover, if you could just talk about him and his sexuality and how that played into his obsessiveness on topics of this matter.
Yeah, I mean, so he's very important here. Obviously directing a lot of this work, and historians have weighed in, including Beverly Gage's recent biography of him, that says that he very likely was involved in a long-term relationship with a male that was very close to him and that worked with him. And I think that there's a lot of sort of figures in this period who we view, I think rightly so, as hypocrites because of the way in which they were living their lives one way, but directing the government to repress homosexuals' lives. And so I think that just sort of speaks to the nature of the fear that was at work in this period and how overwhelming the sort of spirit of the Lavender Scare was. But it is important to know that and to recognize that there were homosexual men who facilitated that Lavender Scare. And I think a lot of them, such as Hoover, did so to direct attention away from them.
Right. And the focus on men, I think about often, like, we're in the midst of an anti-trans moral panic, and so much of it is about trans women, right? The idea that somebody who was born with male genitalia is actually a woman is so threatening to this cultural conception of masculinity. Yeah. And I think that pairs nicely, I mean, not nicely, but in the way that the moral panic or the Lavender Scare and the crackdown that resulted is focused on men and homosexual behavior there as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart connection. And I would say that, in a patriarchal society, which the US is, and particularly so in the mid-20th century, fears about manhood and masculinity really shape a lot of governmental action. And I think also just like cultural responses to changing gender expressions and changing sexual norms. And so, lesbians certainly had difficult experiences during the Lavender Scare, and they were also targeted as well, but not at all to the extent that gay men were. And part of that was that gay men tended to have a lot more public lives. Like, they tended to be a lot more sort of out in the open to the extent that closeted persons were at all. And so that's part of it. But I think at the deeper level, it is this sort of panic around manhood and masculinity. And again, what that meant in the Cold War context, right? We're in this arms race with another nation. We're worried about the future of our society and our nation and our strength at home, because that sort of registers on the world stage. And I think that's how these things sort of got tied together.
I mean, it occurs to me, and I want to move past the 1950s in a second, but that this is really, honestly, the birth of the modern conservative movement that we see to this day, of the linking of anti-communism, which ends up being free market fundamentalism for them, with a social conservatism that was about cracking down on gay people, on lifestyles that they deem outside of the mainstream, or and also, of course, married with their anti-civil rights agenda. I mean, you can see that is the Republican Party really to this day.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right here to point to this moment in which those different components of the right, which aren't necessarily affiliated with the Republican Party in the 1950s, are starting to get stitched together into what we would call the new right in the 1970s, which is this broad coalition of different sorts of conservatives who are linked together in a national movement. A lot of this work is happening at the grassroots level, right? Connecting cultural conservatives to anti-communists to free market radicals, and stitching it together into what we really recognize as a coordinated Republican Party, especially around like the 1980 election and the rise of Ronald Reagan. But absolutely, it's getting forged in the 1950s in the height of the Cold War. It's sort of amping up through the 1960s and the cultural transformations of that era, and really, I think, coalescing in a 1970s movement of grassroots conservatives that has like a religious right that's ascendant.
Yes, and so let's go to the 1970s, right, where the backlash against the revolutions, the civil rights advancements of the 1960s, as well as massive cultural changes of with feminism and progress in those areas. You see the 1970s as an era of backlash, right, the expansion really of the government's role in basically like being tough on crime, the federal government's role, whether it be the origins of the drug war as a way to have that backlash formalized against often black and brown people in this country, but as well as it relates to gay people and using the federal government to crack down on gay folks. What was the role of the gay Republican during that era?
Yeah, because this is a period in which part of what's happening is the development of an I was going to say anti-LGBTQ, but at the time it would have been known as an anti-gay politics that's taking shape in the mid 1970s. You think about 1969 Stonewall. Is this turning point in gay history where so many people start coming out of the closet. And also in the early 1970s, a lot of cities and local municipalities start passing these non-discrimination laws that are tied to homosexuality, towards gay identity. And so that's sort of happening in the early 70s. In the mid 1970s, you have this religious right movement that's just starting to form. They're starting to get united around an anti-abortion cause, but they're also recognizing that sort of gay rights are moving forward. And so there's this backlash effort of anti-LGBTQ stuff that's happening in the late 1970s. This is the moment in which gay Republicans really come out of the closet and start organizing. And there's a particular reason they do so, which is here in California, where I live. In 1977, there's a state ballot initiative that's put forward by a very conservative state legislator from Orange County named John Briggs. And it was Proposition 6, or as it was commonly known, the Briggs Initiative, which was on the 1978 California state ballot. And had it passed, it would have made it illegal for any gay or lesbian person to work in the state's public school system. And so this is the moment in which gay Republicans recognize they have to come out of the closet. They have to start organizing as gay Republicans to defeat this ballot initiative, but also to show the Republican Party, especially in the state of California, hey, we belong to your party. We're Republicans. We believe in, the Republican Party's traditional message of freedom, opportunity, and equality. And we're not only going to defeat this ballot initiative, we're going to push out who are these Bible beaters that are trying to come into our party? Who is this religious right that thinks that they're Republicans? We're going to push them out of the party and make sure they never get a foothold. And so that's the moment in which this is happening really in California, but they are developing a movement that ultimately spreads across the nation. As these gay Republicans say, we belong to this party, we're not going to see it change in the direction that it seems to be going.
They were not successful.
They were not.
It's almost as if that you can't make progress in that regard in this party that targets marginalized people broadly. But it's fascinating that the California element to me.
Yeah.
Harvey Milk, of course, in the 1970s becomes the first openly gay elected official in the country and is assassinated. talk about the role of the San Francisco politics of that time period as well in fostering that backlash within California Republicans.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about Harvey Milk, because one of the most surprising and just wonderful things I discovered as I was in the archives, actually in San Francisco, looking at the papers of the first gay Republican club that was started, which at the time was called Concerned Republicans for Individual Rights. It's now known as Log Cabin Republicans of San Francisco. It's been around since 1977. Harvey Milk was involved with the founding of this organization. He was at the first meeting of this organization because Harvey Milk, although he was a Democrat, he believed that gay people had to, first of all, come out of the closet, and they had to show both political parties that they belonged to them. This idea was none of us are being well represented. And honestly, the Democratic Party wasn't all that much better on gay rights or accepting gay members in the 1970s than the Republicans were. And so there was this notion that this sort of bipartisan organizational effort needed to happen. We'll belong to both. We already belong to both parties, right? We will show ourselves to be visible within both parties. And through that, we will make gay rights, we'll progress gay rights, and we'll show that gay rights are a bipartisan issue, or ideally nonpartisan issue. In San Francisco, it was also really interesting to discover that the local leadership of the Republican Party was incredibly supportive of the formation of these gay Republican clubs, because Republicans were basically so underrepresented in the city. Not many people in San Francisco were registered as Republicans. Republicans didn't have any political offices. And so the Republican leadership there thought, well, maybe the path forward is us tapping into this very large population of homosexuals who live in this city, getting them to register with the Republican Party, and hopefully electing local officials. And so San Francisco is this sort of unique spot in California in many ways, but particularly in the ways that it actually is the birthplace of gay republicanism, which I think most people wouldn't think of. The Republican Party at the state level in California, and certainly in Southern California, that was much more conservative, was not nearly as welcoming or as encouraging as of this development of gay Republicans. But San Francisco, because of the nature of its politics, and because of the fact that Republicans were so underrepresented, it really became, for many years, the sort of central, the nexus of gay republicanism, and certainly formed the sort of foundation upon which the larger movement was built.
And you could probably put a pin there and say this is the original infrastructure for passing Proposition 8. I mean, right? In 2008, was that when Prop 8 passed? I know we're skipping ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think that yes, and I also think the important thing to point to is California again. Like, California is this place of progress, and also this place where we see conservative backlash happening again and again around LGBTQ issues. And there's this old saying that's used a lot in American politics, which is, "As California goes, so goes the nation." This idea that this state, the largest state in the country, is sort of leading indicator of what's going to happen in the country politically. And I think that's right. But I also think that this sort of narrative of progress and backlash that you see over and over again in California is represents the sort of larger development within the country of progress and backlash when it comes to LGBTQ rights. So California, is one of those leading states when it comes to the passage of same-sex marriage. And also it's a place that sort of immediately generates an enormous backlash that becomes a really defining one for the country as, Prop 8 is passed and this huge progressive measure is overturned. And that's seen as like decimating to the development of same-sex marriage rights for the entire country, as it is for a short period of time.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.